Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, Dale and I are just delighted to be joined by a couple of faithful OGs of the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, Nathaniel Sutanto and Cory Brock. Formerly, if you can see his little Zoom screen there, formerly of a PCA church, but now a pastor in the Free Church of Scotland. So now living in Edinburgh instead of Mississippi. But we're here to talk about a book that both of our dear friends here have co-authored, Neo-Calvinism, a Theological Introduction, a book that has received a lot of press, an enormous amount of endorsements. People are very excited about this book, partially because, typically speaking, Neo-Calvinism is thought to be mostly associated with sort of cultural movements. People, when you invoke the phrase Neo-Calvinism, what we immediately begin thinking about is a sort of worldview movements. We begin to think about culture movements. We begin to think about institutions, and we begin to think about this kind of model of Christ and culture that is usually goes by the title transformationalism, of which Kuyper is supposedly sort of the iconic advocate, one might say. But our brothers here have written what they are calling a theological introduction to Neo-Calvinism, arguing in the book that one can't really understand the project that Bavinck and Kuyper are a part of and how to apply it in a sense without really capturing the interior theological vision that informs all the ways in which they apply that to the particular questions of modernity. And so really we want them to come on today and just talk a bit about this book and why they thought it was useful. And so I'm just going to kind of turn it over to you guys really and just begin by asking, again, we have these associations with transformationalism and cultural questions, but you point out in the introduction that you need to remember that Bavinck and Kuyper are theologians first. That's their actual vocation.
Yeah.
And what was it, I guess you could say, that sort of motivated you all in the first place to sort of recapture that more interior theological dimension of Neo-Calvinism?
Yeah, this is a great question, Joe, and maybe I could take the first stab and then Cory could follow through after this. But I think as I reflect more on this sort of question, when Cory and I were doing our PhDs together at the University of Edinburgh on Bavinck, we were realizing just how much of the theological resources within Neo-Calvinism were really quite neglected, not just by other advocates who claim to be Neo-Calvinists, but also by critics of Neo-Calvinism as such, if that makes sense. So both advocates of Neo-Calvinists and critics of Neo-Calvinism associate the title anyway with philosophy, reformational movements, a la Dooyeweerd, cultural activism, a la even, the right-wing material from Reconstructionism of Rushdoony, to even more left-wing folks who want to say that, hey, Christianity has to be allied in a particular way to modernity. We got to reinterpret the old reform thinking. We got to purge ourselves of the older scholasticism, and therefore be more distinctly modern Christians, if that makes sense. So when we actually take a look at the original sources, and the translation of Bavinck, I think, is really, really pivotal for this, to even revisit Kuyper as well, is that Bavinck and Kuyper were profoundly theological and they were confessional. In fact, they argued that they were holding on to the older orthodoxy, but in such a way where that older orthodoxy becomes a resource for the renewal of Protestantism in the late modern age, if that makes sense. So when you take a look at their work, philosophy and politics, journalism, pedagogy, psychology definitely were in their purview, but they always address these topics from a theological foundation. And Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics is really pivotal, but also even Kuyper, and now we're revisiting, I think, the more theological works of Kuyper. Common Grace was not translated until recently, the 2-volume Common Grace, the huge ones that Lexham Press is working on and has published. And, his Encyclopedia of Sacred Theology, only a portion of it is published in English. And people forget that that's actually the magnum opus. It's a work in theology, a work in scripture. And so all of these works were really quite neglected. And so we wanted to mine these texts that are newly translated, some partially translated, to really show forth that Neo-Calvinists who aren't dogmatic in terms of their mode first, in terms of their principial stance, so to speak, isn't actually being cognizant of the original first generation Neo-Calvinist material, if that makes sense. Cory?
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, one of the associations that you will see regularly or in several books is that when the author wants to talk about Neo-Calvinism, the first name that gets mentioned is N.T. Wright. And that's happened in several major Reformed publications over the last decade. And it's a bit confusing to us, but it happens very commonly. One of the reasons for that is because Wright emphasizes the renewal of a vision of salvation as new creation, as opposed to the heavenly life. Wright talks about it a lot, and it's also found in Neo-Calvinism. But Gray mentioned, you've got streams, the North American versions of all sorts. You've got the N.T. Wright, J. Richard Middleton sort of interpretive framework for many folks. You've got the more popular level James Sire, Nancy Pearcey associations for Neo-Calvinism that are entirely worldviewism-based ideas. And so, yeah, just to echo what Gray said, I mean, we wanted to go back to the sources. Historic Neo-Calvinism is not really any of these things. These are downstream versions that took one emphasis, perhaps, of the theological movements in Dutch Neo-Calvinism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and ran with it and took it to its extreme form. And so we just wanted to do a recovery project. And as George Harink in the introduction, or the forward, I should say, says that Neo-Calvinism has been an international movement for a century, but it's not really developed as dogmatics. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to recover that and renew that work, that it is its dogmatic distinctives that were most important and that led the way to all the other things that it's more commonly known for. You guys know this very well. Everybody loves Boving's dogmatics. And it was Boving's dogmatics that was the chief work of Neo-Calvinism. Mm. And so there's a real tension now. I've said this, Gray and I have talked about this in the past, but you've got the tension that for all the negativity that Neo-Calvinism has received over the last while, especially in North America, it's hard to know what to do with it now when everyone wants to use Boving's dogmatics as their own theology, yes, which was the chief theology of Neo-Calvinism. And so there's a little bit of a tension there. Both the critical approaches to the idea of Neo-Calvinism, trying to know what to do with Boving, and realizing that they like him, that they really appreciate him. And so I think our book is trying to help people understand that actually the things that they're critiquing might not have ever been there in the first place.
Right. And the confusion is multiplied when people take a look at Boving and find out that they like him and they've been critical of Neo-Calvinism in the past, and then they decide, well, that means Boving wasn't a Neo-Calvinist, which just historically and theologically just doesn't make sense given where he was in the movement.
Yeah. Well, to that last comment that you made, Cory, about everyone sort of, people read Boving, they like him, and then they want to sort of claim him for their own little tradition. And, we live in an online world. We're a digital people. And the conversation, but I suppose this is like a North American phenomenon, as we were talking about, Gray, earlier before we started recording. But the wars that happen between camps, theological camps online, just can't be ignored because it gets into the pews and pastors have to answer questions from, zealous little people that watch 10 hours of a YouTube video and then have all the answers in the world. But one of the things with Boving and scholasticism that you guys mentioned in the introduction, I'll just go ahead and read this paragraph and then I'll throw out a question you guys can wrestle with. But you say the use of Kuyper and Boving within the contemporary dichotomy between Thomism and Van Tillianism, for example, exemplifies this in a rather stark manner. The desire to distance or append Kuyper or Boving to these movements often produces a rather lopsided reading of the primary sources, such that particular passages are emphasized while others are ignored, reducing these first-generation Neo-Calvinists to either preludes or formidable critics of Thomism or Van Tillianism. In our judgment, this debate has gradually become counterproductive. For these reasons, we have set aside this debate entirely in this present volume. Okay, so you're not going to deal with that question in the volume. Fair enough. But this is a podcast, my brothers. So tell us what you think. And we'll keep in mind that this is your personal opinion, but I see this. I see the Thomist claim Bavinck for their own, that he's in this sort of scholastic tradition. And I see the presuppositionalists say, no, Bavinck is the father of presuppositionalism that gave rise to Van Til's thought. And with the lopsidedness, where do you think, if Bavinck were here today, what he would say to these people that are claiming him?
Do you want to start, Cory? Or do you want me to start? Your smile says you want me to start. Okay. All right.
You went to Westminster, Gray, so you get to take this.
Yeah, it is an interesting thought. I think, maybe we'll answer it this way. Take the preface to the first edition of the Reformed Dogmatics, which has been cited over and over again by so many people, not only in the Twitter sphere but also in the journal articles that were written on Bavinck. Circa 2004 to 2012, especially, there's a flurry of articles on Bavinck because they're really excited that Bavinck's Dogmatics is finally translated. And, we could have added not just Van Til and Thomism, but also Plantinga. Bavinck is and Kuyper are often cited in a couple of footnotes and a lot of philosophy texts as a prelude to Plantinga. So they're only interesting insofar as they set up this other thing, if that makes sense. And the preface to the first edition of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics has some very interesting comments from Bavinck there. He famously said there that Thomas, along with Augustine, Irenaeus, and other church fathers and medieval doctors, are not only fathers for the Roman Catholic Church, but we as Protestants are also indebted toward them, right? They're also fathers to us. And so very positive affirmation of Aquinas. Thomists take a look at that and they love that and run with it, Right. But then a paragraph later, he says, but to look to the past and to cherish the past is not reformed. We need to labor for the future, and there's new things that we got to say. And then you couple that with his preface to the Wonderful Works of God, which wasn't translated in the older Our Reasonable Faith edition. I translated it for the Westminster Seminary Press edition that came out in 2019. He says very frankly there that Abrachel's Reasonable Faith is no longer fruitful for us. We need to say something new, right? Which is very controversial to those who also want to retrieve the older Reformed post-Reformation Orthodox sort of traditions. And so, which is it? Does he really like Aquinas and the older scholastics, or is he really kind of critical of them? And it's a little bit of both. And to say, therefore, that he is just a prelude to one means you got to ignore some other things he says, if that makes sense. So you can take that sentence and run with it and then ignore what he says about, to just cherish the past is not reformed. We can't just do that. We got to also labor for the future and learn from modernity and things like that. Means to take holistically everything that Bavinck has said. On the other side, I think with the Van Til side, not just Bavinck, especially Kuyper here as well, you got the lectures on Calvinism, Calvinism as a life system, Calvinism as a worldview. Bavinck argues in the beginning of his apologetic section that, the faith is not the conclusion of an argument, but it's a presupposition for the argument, right? Wonderful material there for Van Tillians to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I like worldview, I like presuppositions. But then he also says all these, Thomas is a father. We can't just get rid of that. He was critical of Aquinas in a number of ways, preferred Bonaventure in a number of ways, but he didn't have this wholesale approach of, when I think about the Van Til stuff, while Calvinism is a whole self-conscious and enclosed system, Roman Catholicism is another enclosed system. Now there's an antithesis between the two of them, just as there's an antithesis between Calvinism and secularism, if that makes sense. I think with Bavinck, he sees Christianity as a worldview, yes, but that Christian worldview for Bavinck includes the continuities in some aspects between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. He didn't see Calvinism as a worldview as over against Romanism, Arminianism, and modernism as all distinct worldviews together, if that makes sense. But rather, he saw the whole historiography of the Christian faith as together, including some Roman Catholic elements where we have continuities with them. For instance, doctrine of God, as we all are aware about, especially today. So he didn't see there to be a distinct Calvinistic doctrine of God as opposed to a Roman Catholic doctrine of God. Maybe there are some little disagreements here and there, but overall, as a whole, the Reformation took up a lot of what the Roman Catholics authors said, especially in the pre-Reformation era, not post-Reformation Catholics, but the pre-Reformation era, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas especially, and Augustine, of course. So I think that's so for some of the Van Tilens to take a look at Bavinck, that's why they're going to be critical of some aspects, and you're just going to take some strands. Another thing to say about Kuyper, maybe, when Kuyper argued that Calvinism is a whole life system and Christ is Lord over every area of life, he oftentimes said this in the context of an affirmation of democracy, pluralism, and the social conditions of modernity. And I said this in a different podcast before, and basically, when Kuyper was saying that, he was arguing, if Christ is Lord, then Christians are not. And so if that's the case, then we cannot have a theocratic state here, because that would be placing Christians as Lord. If Christ is Lord, he in his common grace is patient with unbelievers, and so believers have to coexist with unbelievers. And as a Christian state, therefore, we're not to impose a Christian hegemony, if that makes sense. So, and I think, especially when I'm thinking about the Rushdunian use of Van Til, which uses that Kuyper quote all the time, and they think about a Reconstructionist movement, that's distinctly not what Kuyper had envisioned, if that makes sense. So lots of things we can say, but one more thing, this is probably the most important thing to say. This is a very North American conversation, very distinctly when we're talking about the Dutch conversations on Bavinck and Kuyper. The conversation there had almost nothing to do with Aquinas and Van Til, but it had to do more so with the legacy of Berkouwer, legacy of Klaas Schilder, how much of their thought warrants us to revise older Christian faiths and older Protestant confessions, how much of what they say means that we got to actually stand on these Protestant confessions, what's the relationship between Christianity and science. Those are the sorts of conversations they were having. And we do well to just zoom out of our own American context and take a look at, hey, how were Kuyper and Bavinck actually received in the Dutch milieu and beyond, not just the American blogosphere.
Yes.
That's really That's really, really interesting. This is one of those reasons that in my house, I have a special bookshelf with all my books. I don't have that many books, but I have a special bookshelf of my sort of OG. If a Protestant can have patron saints, then if I were able to have them, who would they be? Well, it's Bavinck and Lewis. And one of the things, oddly, nobody ever puts Bavinck and Lewis really together as thinkers, but Lewis doesn't read Bavinck. But one of the things that's very interesting, nevertheless, that relates them to me always in my mind, is precisely what you said about this relationship to tradition. That even though there is this deep reception of this rich Christian tradition, there is nevertheless this recognition that we live in this kind of odd, peculiar modern space. And that what the project is, in a sense, is to kind of take you guys have talked about worldview as a map instead of a set of lenses, is to take kind of the map that we've received, if one could speak of the tradition that way, to take this kind of collective cartography and then stare at our world and say, how does it help inform and help us navigate that world? And in a sense, what's recognized in both Bavinck and a person like Lewis is the map is, in fact, only as good as its ability to help you navigate reality itself. And in fact, what that does, instead of deconfirming the map for them as it confirms the map, is that here we are in this modern circumstance, and yet the map is still useful in some way. It can kind of adapt. It has unique things to say to unique circumstances. And I'm thinking of this even in kind of contemporary Catholic discourse. There was a guy, I'm seeing all these authors like Zach Huber and Jordan Daniel Wood on Maximus, and then Mark Spencer's recent work on the human person. And what all of them are kind of pointing out is the contribution kind of the Christian hive mind to the development of unique emphases that develop and really only come to their own in some sense in the modern world. So that Mark Spencer, who's really trying to consolidate the whole Catholic tradition on the question of man's nature, will nevertheless say in that book, maybe there's something about human nature that we understand uniquely right now because of historical conditions that have sort of forced us to stare at man in a particular and kind of rigorous way. And it seems to me that there's something, I don't know, consonant with Bavinck in there, that we're receiving the tradition, but we're inflecting it and we're applying it in unique ways, which does bring up the question, I suppose, just while we're on this topic. How do you relate, nevertheless, the reception of kind of that old grammar, if we could put it that way, like scholasticism as a kind of, if we could speak of scholasticism as an inherited set of terms or discourse or ways of carving up the world, Bavinck's, some of the language you find in Bavinck and Kuyper that is added to that kind of grows out of it, but it's its own, it kind of comes from its own world, its own philosophical world. How do you think they relate these two things? Is one sort of organically, if we can use that motif, growing out of the other, or are these, how radically new is the neo, you might say, in Neo-Calvinism, if one could put it that way?
Yeah, Joe, thanks. I mean, another, just to take it one step back, another connection between Bavinck and Lewis is that in Bavinck's latter part of his career, he really turned towards the project of mere Christianity. I mean, after he had written the Reformed Dogmatics, and he stood by that, but a lot of his late works are really focused on uniting Christian people around a sort of mere Christianity. All of that, and I think this leads to the question you're asking, but also takes us back to what we were just talking about, is what we've called the orthodox yet modern character of Neo-Calvinism. So that's kind of a title that we've given to the quality and character of the historic Neo-Calvinist, Kuyper and Bavinck in particular. And in it, there's an emphasis that we want to conserve without being too wedded to conservatism. Right. And we want to progress without being progressivists in theological terms. And really, the Thomas Van Til thing picks right up on Joe's question that he's just given us, because, well, for Bavinck, it's all about looking for truth wherever it can be found. And if you were to ask, is Bavinck a Thomist, or is he the prelude to Van Tilianism, I think Bavinck would dismiss the question precisely because of the endings. You know, he doesn't want ist or ism to be added, though he loves Thomas. And yes, the best of Van Til, and there is very helpful moments in Van Til, does derive from Bavinck. But he can't be overly associated as a disciple of Thomas or a prelude to Van Til in any exclusive way, precisely because of his emphasis on, I mean, this is rather cliche, but he truly is Reformed and Catholic. And that's the best way, I think, to think about him. And that lends itself, I think, to your question, Joe. Well, I mean, Bavinck's very explicit, isn't he, that Christianity doesn't need to be wed to any particular philosophy and any particular grammar, that grammars can be borrowed from any age, from any culture and context. And that Christianity might arise and develop in a context that doesn't have access to Plato and Aristotle, but did hear the gospel and say the same things in very different philosophical grammars, right? Depending on the background and the cultures and the times. And so I think the Neo-Calvinist tradition tries to be aware of that, and it's part of that same idea of conservation but not conservatism, progress without progressivism, all for the sake of being able to speak the truth to today, to the contemporary. And back to Gray's comment about Abrakel, Bavinck says it's indeed controversial. I think I like Abrakel better than maybe Bavinck did, but he says he's not really very useful anymore. And he's particularly talking there about for young people. He says he's not really a book that is a theology that has any use for young minds in modernity, and so that's one of the reasons he wrote his shorter systematic theology, that's just an example that he's trying to address the people in front of him. So this is ministry. This is trying to be persuasive. This is trying to say we can speak truthfully and persuasively simultaneously, and adopt old grammars into new forms. But of course, one of the things we say in the book is that we don't have a chapter on the doctrine of God because there's not much to say.
Right.
It's if our book is about unique theological contributions that the Neo-Calvinist fathers offer us, the doctrine of God isn't really one of them. They are largely, to contradict myself, Thomist when it comes to that subject, for lack of a better term. And so it's a yes and no, it's a both and of course you're probably thinking there, well, you use the term the organic, right? The organic is the most popular term, modern term, I guess, that they appropriate into their grammar to speak about theology. But I think it's important to remember that the organic is a classical concept, right? And a concept that merely describes an obvious truth about nature, and one that's very biblical. And so, we try to say in the book several times that the organic metaphor is derivative, not first from Schelling, but first from Jesus saying that he's the vine, that we're the branches and he's the vine.
Yes, God was the original organicist.
That the primary ways of viewing new creation is through the image of the garden, right? And so these concepts go much further back than Schelling, and of course Plato speaks of the organic as well. It's a very classical concept of the union of unity and diversities in teaming with life. And so, yeah, again, that's a really big question, and one of the ways you have to evaluate this question is on a case by case basis, and looking at the different theological loci and how in certain areas they did more or less of appropriating scholastic grammar versus appropriating romanticism, which was probably their most significant philosophical interlocutor.
Yeah. It's interesting. The organic motif is so intuitive for me. So I run a classical K through 12 program here in Brevard County, Florida. And one of the things Joe mentioned, Lewis and Bavinck, and this idea of contextualizing the tradition for modernity. And if you're going to train young minds how to move around in the world that Providence has found them, then you have to contextualize the tradition for them. It almost seems like that is the natural, organic way that pedagogy is done. One of the things that strikes me as odd is the scholastic tradition was doing precisely that for their moment. They're pulling on the tradition as been handed to them up to that point and developing out thoughts that were revolutionizing the way that people understood reality. And it would be sort of hubristic if we thought that or it would be ignorant if we thought that it just ended there and we have nothing to contribute. Lewis talks about tradition or natural law, the Tao, as being able to change, but from the inside, right? You can't tinker with the Tao from the outside, but you can certainly change it from the inside. And Jesus is a good example of this, with how people understood the role of women and marriage, and the meek and the humble. And he's telling this to a Greco-Roman world that's based on an honor system. And that would have been like, what is this guy talking about? He's sitting on a mountain talking about peaceful, meek, humble people inheriting the world. That's weird, right? So it just seems intuitive to me that what Bavinck's project was about was something that we ought to, even if we don't intellectually assent to all the particulars, practically, in raising our children and discipling the people in our churches and affecting our communities, which I guess is why Bavinck's cultural stuff is always emphasized in Kuyper's. we ought to practically function this way. So there's a question there. You mentioned the garden, and Boving's vision of this organicism emerging out of the fact that grace sort of restores nature. We get back to the Edenic state through God's common grace being worked out in the family and the city and the church. And this might be a silly question. It's a technical one, but I think it's an important one. You use the word several times in the book, grace restoring nature. And in the sort of scholastic tradition, they talk about grace perfecting nature. And I wonder, is there a difference there? Or does Bavinck mean the same thing? And the reason I think that is probably important, because I watch a lot of the sort of Christian nationalist movement right now in North America, is pulling on that principle that grace perfects nature, and they're emphasizing it so heavily because it's holding up a big pillar of their system of thought. And they're very critical of Bavinck in this respect. So I wonder so that's the question. When Bavinck says, and Kuyper talk about grace restoring nature, state of Eden and all that, does he really mean what the scholastic tradition meant when they talked about grace perfecting nature?
Yeah, Dill, thanks. I mean, let me just say one thing about your comment prior, and then I'll take that up. Yeah, I mean, of course, this is the task of preaching, right? Isn't it? That
right.
There is no preaching without contextualization. And if we don't update and progress our grammars in any way, or recognize that there's still so much to learn theologically, then I don't really know why we continue to produce new systematic theologies and carry on. I mean, we can just read what we've already done. And of course, we're all intuitively aware of that, but I think sometimes in the debates and discourse, you said it. I mean, Jesus was a master at contextualization himself. He goes to the woman at the well and speaks to her about the water of life standing next to the well. The metaphors he chooses are so appropriate for the moment, for communicating the gospel through the lens of embodied experience. He says to Nicodemus, you need to be born again, to help him understand that he needs to understand his passivity, that he's got to become like a baby. He thinks he can do it himself, right? And so these are gospel contextualizations that go back to the very beginning and to our Lord himself. And I think these are, biblical backgrounds to the project of being Orthodox yet modern. Can I ask, how does maybe the Christian nationalist movement or others understand or interpret grace perfecting nature? What do they take the term perfecting to entail in just a few sentences or so?
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. So I think what's behind Dale's comment there is there's, for instance, this pretty famous book floating around out there right now. Stephen Wolfe just published this Case for Christian Nationalism. And a lot of the way that a lot of the grammar he's drawing upon to sort of make his case is a nature that sort of grace doesn't destroy nature, but I think actually he might be drawing on grace doesn't restore nature but perfects nature. It could be, in fact, that he's actually I think he might frame himself over against Neo-Calvinism, and maybe he's drawing on an older grammar, but he's somehow linking the case basically to kind of an older view, a more reformed view of nature and grace, and it sort of gives the imprimatur of reformed kind of osmosis to sort of this nationalist rhetoric. If you can say that whatever the nationalist program is effectively is an outgrowth of some notion of nature. Something like that. I think that's sort of in the background. I'm not exactly sure how that goes on to a critique of Kuyper and Bavinck, though.
Yeah. So, I asked the question just because I've heard the perfection of nature and that phrase interpreted differently at different times. And I mean, let me say perhaps what Bavinck means by it, and then see if that helps us. For Bavinck, and I write this in the book, The point is that the goal of new creation is precisely the same as the point of creation itself, right? And this is the Neo-Calvinist emphasis that eschatology precedes soteriology, and even that eschatology is fundamental to the creation concept. That the point has always been Emmanuel, God with us, divine condescension anyway, if you want to put it like that. That God was always creating humanity to dwell with us, and that the consummative hope of the garden was that we would have the beatific vision, that we would see God, that we would be with God. And so grace restores nature. It restores nature and perfects it. If you want to mean by that it puts the pieces back together that the moral corruption broke, and it takes it to its consummative form, which was always the point, yet by different means. The first mean was obedience. The second is the second Adam, the first Adam and the second Adam, right? And so that's all we mean by it, really. But the emphasis is that the problem with creation, maybe a second thing and here's where the difference might arise, that Bavinck and Kuyper both want to differentiate themselves from what they understand as a Roman Catholic interpretation of that same sequence, the creation sequence, where the perfection of nature was already a need prior to the problem of sin, is how Bavinck understands Rome, to 19th century Thomism, really Roman Catholic versions of Thomism. You guys are familiar with the donum superaddendum discussions and all that. And so Bavinck understands that grace perfects nature, can be used to suggest that there is something wrong with nature apart from ethical corruption. And what he wants to emphasize is that the problem of creation is not ontology, it's ethics. Right. The problem of creation is not what we are, it's not being human, it's what we did and what we do. And so grace restoring nature is a moral renovation. And now that leads us in other directions too that are probably different from the contrary position that you described. One would be, and this is a difference between, for instance, us and maybe the way David Van Drunen, who is himself a product of the Neo-Calvinist movement, but he wants to articulate it differently. He wants to see the eschatological moment as one of total dissolution of creation and a complete new creation in every way. He wants to see the Petrine formula of dissolving and wrapping up like a garment and burning as a holistic, very literal idea. And that informs what he's going to say about how do we relate to culture in the present, right? Because there's nothing to maintain. There's no germ or seed or anything or kernel. Whereas Bavinck and Kuyper have real similarities there. They believe that there's not a single artifact of human construction that will remain in the new creation, yet there is nevertheless much more continuity, that the metaphors of the eschaton are ones that reference, and this is the point I'm trying to make, ones that reference fire by way of burning away the ethical impurity.
Right.
That the problem is ethics, not ontology. And so that's the main idea in Grace Restores Nature.
Yeah. And I wonder if one of the things that perhaps puts all these together, of course, what you're, what you're describing reminds me, I guess, Mattson's dissertation on Bavinck, right? I guess it's titled, "Is It Restored to Our Destiny?"
Right.
And it puts that a little bit together, that destiny was always sort of written in creation, but we're restored to creation precisely by being restored to its end. What I was going to ask about that, though, was bringing this back actually into cultural conversation. One of the things that I suspect is actually a tension here is that when we define nature and the restoration of nature and the perfection of nature, it could be that we're drawing a concept of nature overly much from. Sometimes we can draw a nature from what nature is, either always or for the most part, in kind of good Aristotelian fashion. And yet, one of the things that seems to me that the gospel does, even though we don't abandon the kind of always or for the most part conception, what we do recognize in the ethical sphere is that we're not ethically normal. And so, one of the things the gospel does say to marriage, for instance, is what happened either always or for the most part in actual marriages before the coming of the Christ. Well, it might not have been what was most natural in some more fundamental theological sense of that term nature. And then what does Christ, the coming of the Christ and the Holy Spirit sort of do to inject into the world of marriage? Well, it injects men and women that are faithful to one another in some unique way. And you see literally, historians can talk about a sexual revolution of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, because the Holy Spirit and love comes into the world in some way that actually restores marriage to what it was always supposed to have been and what is the human heart has always wanted it to be. And perhaps one of the things that comes up in a question like nationalism is whether or not, in these complex modern circumstances, whether or not what it means to have neighbors and to be a world that moves toward one another and is related to one another. Perhaps there are ways in which the gospel forces us to imagine imagine what nature should be, what it is and what it should be, rather than just this is the way it's always been and we can't deviate from that. And I suppose the way I'll generate that into a question is just to say, you're speaking, we're kind of bringing it back to this cultural sphere. You're bringing up Neo-Calvinism as a theological movement, as opposed to most people's association with it. And yet, presumably, that large theological association and all the particulars of that theology nevertheless cash out in some way in the world in those cultural and civil aspects that most people emphasize when they think about Neo-Calvinism. And so I guess one thing I'd ask you guys is like, maybe one way of asking this is like, what when you think now on the backside of a project like this about Neo-Calvinism and its kind of civil value, its its political theological value, if you will, for Christians in 2023 in the modern world, how does that theology sort of smash into that world that we more typically associate, I guess you could say, with Neo-Calvinism? Now that you're kind of on the other side of this project, and you might think, okay, what is the implication of all of that for the modern 2023 world of politics and culture?
That's a tough question, Joe. It's a huge question. Maybe a couple of comments. The first one, I think, dovetails well with what Cory was saying, and your nationalism questions there. I think the fact that the Neo-Calvinists emphasis this idea of grace restoring nature means a couple of things. First is you have to have some kind of operative view of nature for that to work. If there's that caricature of Neo-Calvinism not liking natural order, natural law talk, I think that's a myth, and I think we can move away from that. But at the same time, because of the language of restores, what you were commenting there, Joe, and what Cory was getting at too with Brian Matson's work as well, is that our perceptions of the natural order needs the gospel, needs redemption, needs spiritual illumination. So, the older natural law tradition makes a distinction between natural law and its relative application, things like that. And the Neo-Calvinists want to further our humility with respect to perceptions of that natural law by the language of common grace, even, such that perhaps one of the differences between Neo-Calvinism and nationalism, and maybe this is why they're critical of the Neo-Calvinist movement, is the reticence of the earlier Neo-Calvinists, even Bavinck and Kuyper, of saying that my perception of the natural order in this contemporary milieu is the natural order itself. Cory has a wonderful section on that with natural law and common grace in one of the chapters, I think, Common Grace in the Gospel. And he really tries to illuminate that relationship between the two. So I think, we want to be very slow in asserting that my natural state of affairs, my nation right now, rightly perceives the natural order, and therefore everyone should live in accordance with my perception of the natural order. Some people say, well, that's Neo-Calvinist capitulation to a kind of subjective mode of thinking or something, or a more chastened view of the role of reason and natural intuition with regard to natural law. But that's definitely a distinctive of the Neo-Calvinist project, which leads me to a second comment, which is I think people don't really recognize this, but at least contemporary readers of Neo-Calvinism, that the Neo-Calvinist project is very much, I think, tethered with a healthy but chastened affirmation of democratic pluralism. I think there's patience with regard to other people, precisely because we recognize that Christians too have a need for the gospel to perceive the natural order, and also others might perceive the natural order better than you do by common grace. And so we in the political situation today, I think Kuyper and Bavinck would want, a Christian party and so on. But again, that Christian party would want collaboration, would want to foster a sense of patience and hopefulness with respect to conversing from the bottom up, rather than institutionalizing Christian projects or something like, or Christian law, or Christian obligations. Because this is not the time of the eschaton. This is the time of common grace. This is not the right time for that. This is in the redemptive historical order, this is still the period of God's common grace, of patience. And so third, I think a healthy sense of resisting polarization, and also again, an optimism for persuasion and collaboration with the other, if that makes sense. Dale, I think you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to ask a question on that, because I think the conversation, Brad Littlejohn has been writing about this. He's the president of the Davenant Institute, and our friends, we've been thinking about this and talking about what you're saying a lot recently, because we have to. So, right, if Bavinck would say, let's have a Christian party, but let's not institutionalize our Christian, you said earlier, we don't want a Christian hegemony. Would Bavinck be, and Kuyper maybe, would they be for privileging Christian institutions? So like on a real practical level, would it be like, we're going to give tax breaks to Christian 501c3s, but we're not going to give it to the Mormons or the Muslims or the Jews or something?
Cory's about to answer something profound, I'm sure. But one caveat before Cory gives his profound answer is there is a section in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics where it says something about we got to, institutionalize Sabbath rest and against heresy and so on. But then right after that, he says, but that really does depend on the context. It depends on whether the people themselves want it. So again, it's Neo-Calvinism has always been a grassroots movement, which is reflective of the people. And so if there are people in your nation that are not Christian, then they need to be served as well. They need to have the full freedom to pursue their worldviews in their own way. This is the Kuyperian system of polarization. Cory.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the determination of the possibility of Christian commonwealth, which is real according to Neo-Calvinism and was sought after by Kuyper and Bavinck, is not never because the state has the ability to determine theological logic in any way, and only because of really ministry at the end of the day. And so for them, it's all about the movement, as Gray just put it, from the bottom up, from the organic church doing its work and doing its job and getting out there. And so the question is not ever, are we winning? Are we getting our goals in terms of our institutions? But more of are we staying faithful to the gospel ministry? And that's a ministry of word and witness, word and mercy. It's ultimately a ministry of persuasion. The hope and the goal is that it produces a commonwealth. It produces a Christian party that rises to power. But that Christian party, for Kuyper, as he did rise to the prime minister seat, was never to privilege Christianity explicitly in any obvious way. I mean, part of what did happen was that the Christian party that you speak of wanted to make sure and petition the government of the Netherlands that Christian schools received government funding, and so did Muslim schools, and so did Buddhist schools. And so this is commonly known as the pillarization. movement or the result of that idea. Now, whether that was wise or not in every way, there's lots of detail, there's lots of policy at play and all that. The conceptual apparatus underneath is that the state as an institution does not have the capability to determine theology or apply it. It is merely the arm of justice, and so that was Kuyper and Bavinck's conviction. I mean, another maybe thing to say is that at the heart of it, the idea, I mean, this is what Neo-Calvinism means very literally for them. Neo-Calvinism for Kuyper and Bavinck is the idea that God matters for all of life because all of life is lived in the presence of God. I mean, that's really the heartbeat of what Neo-Calvinism means. They understood Calvinism to mean that Christianity has holistic implications for all of life. And the additional idea for them is that precisely because of the presence of God. And so all of us live coram Deo. So, when we have these discussions, I know that this is where things can get into lots of debate, this field of public theology and how to apply these ideas to the workspace, for example, or the state or wherever it may be.
Right.
But, I find that even in these conversations where people disagree, we all pretty much agree that God has to matter for all of life, and that faith has to matter for the workplace, and faith has to matter for the family life and for our kids' education and for the state in some sense, right? It's just a matter of the details. And so if nothing else, in the Reformed tradition, we all have to say, because we all stand before the presence of God, God matters for everything we do. I mean, one of the places to hang your hat from Scripture that Bavinck wanted to hang his hat was in 1 Timothy, that godliness is profitable for all things, valuable in every way for whatever you're doing, right? And so, I mean, that is Neo-Calvinist public theology in brief, I'd say. And of course, there's many different applications, and there's plenty of people who have applied that down the Neo-Calvinist stream and the various tributaries that have developed, where Gray and I would both find it very unhelpful.
Yeah.
But they are still working maybe with the basic idea.
Yeah, it's interesting though. There's some living contributions nevertheless, and maybe this is a good way to kind of bring us in sort of for a landing here. My church, I attend a PCA church in the Dallas area in Texas, and we have a new pastor, a fairly young guy, really wonderful guy, about in his mid-30s, a little younger than me. But he's inherited this church with a good number of members and such. And he's really trying to put together a philosophy of ministry, and he's trying to have a lot of people in the church come together and help, kind of hive mind think through a philosophy of ministry. And one of the things he's drawing from is this organic motif. How, when we're thinking through what does it mean to be a church in Dallas in 2023, what does that mean relative to the church as an institution? But in what other ways are we an organic church? In what ways does that have to do with, parish groups, for instance? Are the boundaries of a parish group exactly the same things as the boundaries of the institutional church? Who you can give the sacrament to is a little bit different than the answer to the question of who you can read the Bible and pray with, for instance. And so there's all these sorts of interesting, kind of rich, and especially in a world where Christianity is kind of this odd, very, very diversified organism in a public way. These are actually, I think, very rich resources to draw upon to think through actually what turn out to be very complicated sociological questions for ordinary Christians right now, and how to think about how to relate to other institutions and whatever. But maybe a way of kind of bringing that in for a landing is to ask you guys, you're on the other side of this project. This book's about to get published. I'm very excited. I think this is going to be a really rich resource for the church. This is a really fantastic, really well done and well put together text. What maybe as you're reflecting on the backside, what was maybe the most surprising thing? I'd be curious to hear from you. What was the most surprising thing for you to discover in Kuyper and Bavinck that, I don't know, moved you the most, or something like that, as you're trying to put together this volume? And what do you think is kind of like maybe a kind of question for that is, what do you think future work? This is a seminal text in a lot of ways. I think this is going to be an important text. What comes on the other side of this text? What's future work to be done in these topics that you think? I think that's a good way of synthesizing this.
That's a great question, Joe. I think one initial response about what was most surprising to me was how many times Kuyper and Bavinck themselves emphasized that it is in the doctrine of Scripture that they were most innovative. For some reason, they keep coming back to that theme in numerous texts where Bavinck would say the arrival or the renaissance of Calvinism, or the new form of Calvinism, has presented the doctrine of Scripture in the most acute form. That's what he says in one line. Kuyper as well devoted a lot of pages on the doctrine of Scripture and inspiration. And so I think that was what was most surprising for me. And in terms of future work, and I think, by the way, that's George Hunsinger also says that's the one area that we got to hone in on when he talked about the difference between the Neo-Calvinist tradition from someone like Carl F. H. Henry on the one side and the post-liberal tradition of Hans Frey on the other side. The Neo-Calvinist tradition, he actually says, is a third way. So the third way discourse much precedes the current Twitter blogosphere. The Twitter way is the first way. Is that what you're going to say? The third way is the first way, Cory? All right. Second thing, I think for more future work, well, hopefully the handbook of the T.N.T. Clark Handbook to Neo-Calvinism establishes that future work, because it just shows how the various tributaries formed from this lake or river of Neo-Calvinism from Kuyper and Bavinck. So, there needs to be more work on, there needs to be a reevaluation, honestly, of Berkouwer, of Klaus Schilder, of Herman Dooyeweerd, of Alvin Plantinga, in light of the recognizance of the actual over corpus of Kuyper and Bavinck that we have in our hands here today. I think the Anglophone world is honestly still very much under-resourced. And when you read Berkouwer and all these other second, third generation sort of figures, so much of their work, incredibly enough, as we're reading them again now, is just critical commentary on Kuyper and Bavinck. And oftentimes those works were not translated. So now we actually have access to it. So there is a volume out there about all this. And the handbook, I think, is a starting point for that sort of evaluative work.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of something surprising. I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me is we focused the book largely on Kuyper and Bavinck because we wanted to focus on the first generation and recover, the sources, the most original sources. But I mean, another author that we dip into from time to time in the book is J.H. Bavinck. And I think J.H. Bavinck has probably been the most surprising and the most delightful way resource for us over the last couple of years. J.H., well, I'll say this. One of the things that maybe Herman and Abraham that is Kuyper, don't do maximally is the type of redemptive historical exegesis that would develop in the Neo-Calvinist tradition just after them. You see it in seed form, especially in Kuyper, especially in his work on Adam and Christ and the redemptive fulfillment of humanity through the kind of development of the concept of the first and second Adam. But it's not until J.H. Bavinck and, of course, Voss simultaneously that you get this blossoming of redemptive historical hermeneutics. And redemptive historical hermeneutics, of course, is not created by Neo-Calvinism. Obviously, it's a 2,000-year-old endeavor. But there is significant contribution to it from the Neo-Calvinist tradition, and you see it in seed form in Kuyper and Bavinck. But I look for it more, I think, over the years of reading them. But J.H. Bavinck is where it really begins to blossom in terms of guys who stayed in the Netherlands. Of course, Voss came to the States and developed it there. so that's just something to mention. I think that there's a ton of work to do in J.H. Bavinck. I think that he is going to be the delight of many readers over the next decade. And speaking of Lewis, I mean, talk about if there's a connection between the Dutch and Lewis, it's J.H. Bavinck. I think he is called him the Lewis of the Neo-Calvinists. I think he reads like Lewis. I think he's insightful like Lewis. So. And we've got a couple guys, one guy in particular doing a PhD on J.H. Bavinck right now at Edinburgh, Jack Gamble Smith. The other, what were we talking about? Books. Oh yes, future projects. Well, yeah, as Gray mentioned, so we're just for clarification, the T&T Clark, the handbook that Gray was referring to is a different book.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah. So. We are about to submit the T&T Clark handbook on Neo-Calvinism, which is a 40-author, 40-chapter handbook, scholarly handbook.
Okay. Edited by you two.
Edited by us, yes.
Okay.
And it spans, historical figures, theological loci, legacy questions, relationship to patristic theology, medieval theology, all those sorts of things. So there'll be a lot more to dig into with that, and we have authors from 6 different continents, which represents the international movement that this has been, from names like Nicholas Wolterstorff to Tim Keller to Rich Mao and many others. So so that'll be out sometime, Lord willing, in 2024. Well, we're nearly done with that. I mean, I think one of the things that I think will happen with this revival of Neo-Calvinist primary texts is the constructive recovery of Neo-Calvinism's dogmatic tradition. So we really have yet to get guys that are trying to do original work that's not merely historical theology. Gray and I have done a little bit, but we, as Harding said at the beginning of our new book with Lexham, Neo-Calvinism has not developed in the last century as dogmatics, and it's exactly that idea of development. Are we writing from this tradition, but not as mere historians? We're doing theology. We're constructing. We're carrying on exactly what they tried to teach, which is orthodox yet modern, conservative, conserve and progress for the sake of the church. And so I just think that there's going to be a blossom of constructive texts and works, popular and academic, and the biblical theology movement is a testament to that to some degree, but also in more acutely in the dogmatic sphere. So
if any of the contributors of that handbook, a couple of outstanding chapters that have not yet been submitted, if you're listening to this, we're just waiting on y'all. So two or three chapters left.
No pressure.
Yeah, 2 or 3 chapters left. You all know who you are. So
very good. Well, Cory, Gray, thank you, brothers. Thank you for your hard work.
Thank you
guys
much.
are just machines. You're putting out such good resources, and Joe and I are interested. We've been following you for a long time, and what Eglinton is doing, and just the whole group of Bavinck Dutch theology brothers. So keep it up. We'll look forward to the handbook, and perhaps when it comes out, we'll grab a few of the guys and we'll have a big discussion, and that will be 2024. So we'll get our dose of Cory and Gray next year, God willing, unless we all die, in which case we'll see you in the restored Eden. All right. So Neo-Calvinism, a Theological Introduction by Lexham Press, coming out very soon. Everyone pick up a copy and email all your questions to Dr. Gray Sutanto, because he doesn't have anything better to do. But thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, guys. We're grateful.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. We'll see you next time.